Before we get the ball rolling on this video where I'm about to speak quite favorably of the Bazaar, I want you to know that I've been brought in as a moderator for the Bazaar Discord, so if you're the type of person who might be concerned about a conflict of interest, I'm not trying to hide that. With that said, if you're familiar with me and not familiar with the Bazaar, let's first answer the question of, what is the Bazaar? Honestly, I would argue that the Bazaar is really the first game of its genre, but if you want to give it an existing label, I would refer to it as an asynchronous auto battler with a lot of deck building DNA. In the Bazaar, you select a character. You're given some amount of starting gold to purchase items to improve your board, and ultimately your goal is to survive 10 days in the Bazaar, an intergalactic marketplace. Think of each day as a turn, so you have 10 turns that you need to play out. Each day you'll be presented with different things to do. You might visit a merchant, you might fight a creature, you might find a cute animal in the street, and then you'll have to decide between petting it or trying to attack it. Regardless of your choices throughout the day, your end goal is survival. At the end of each day, or at the end of each turn, you'll fight a player who's on the same day that you are. If you run out of lives, well then you start the run all over again. If you finish a run completely, you get the maximum amount of rewards possible, and then you restart your run. That's really the short version of how the Bazaar works. This video is not really supposed to be a how to play Bazaar video. I more or less just want to talk about the things that are most exciting to me about the Bazaar. But if you had no idea about what the Bazaar was, that should give you a decent idea of what type of game we're looking at here. So, why do I care about the Bazaar? Well, right from the jump, I knew I was going to be interested in the Bazaar because of its unique approach to a subgenre of card games that I particularly enjoy, drafting games, or deck building games, or whatever you want to call them. Now, before the Bazaar's announcement, I already loved deck building games, but if you hadn't heard of a deck building game before, if you haven't had the chance to play one, the quick catch-up is pretty simple. In deck building games, you're not playing a constructed format. You're not looking at a collection of cards and adding them to your deck. Instead, you start the game with a deck of 10 predetermined cards, and these predetermined cards are usually relatively underwhelming, and over the course of the game, you purchase new cards, fight enemies, and even destroy some of those underwhelming cards you start the game with. In the digital single-player world, the most successful deck building game is probably Slay the Spire. In the multiplayer deck building world, depending on whether you count auto battlers as deck builders or not, the most successful one of those is probably Battlegrounds or Teamfight Tactics, though again, there's some confusion about what exactly an auto battle and a deck builder is, but for the purposes of this video, there's not much of a difference between the two. And then in physical media, my favorite deck building game is either Marvel Legendary or DC deck building, but the most famous examples are like Dominion, Star Realms, and Hero Realms. The end result of this progression system is a very dynamic gameplay loop, often referred to as emergent gameplay. Now, emergent gameplay is often a sought-after concept among card game designers because you want to avoid players feeling like their decision-making can be tracked in a flowchart. You want to avoid situations where the player feels like they've been presented with the same question multiple times over the course of a handful of games. Even if their decision-making is similar from game to game, you don't want them to feel that. For example, let's say you have a really complicated play involving, 2 to 3 card interactions that result in some big explosive turns. If you look at that play in a constructed format game, it's significantly less rewarding because oftentimes you'll be taking a deck list from somebody else online, or maybe you've seen somebody do that combo before, and then you've built your deck around it. Well, that's less rewarding than if you saw an item pop up in the middle of your deck building run, and you're like, oh, I want that item, and then later you discover this 2 to 3 card combo that works really well with that card that you didn't know about before you selected that initial card. It makes you feel like you've dynamically discovered something, even though that combo is very, very intentionally designed in the game to work that way. And that feeling of discovery is something you just can't really get out of a constructed game in the same way. There have been attempts at digital deck building games before, none of which really feel like they've taken full advantage of the digital medium. Adapting a traditional deck building game or a traditional drafting game to digital comes with a variety of challenges. The exact moment I knew I was going to love the Bazaar is when I saw their first open development video. You see, for the first few years of development, Tempo Storm was developing the Bazaar entirely in the public's eye. Decisions would be discussed to the public before they were finalized, players would get to see artwork before it was finished, and the whole purpose of this was to get player feedback before the game even existed. That could help shape the game into the best version it could possibly be. And in theory, it's a noble idea, but developing a game so openly comes with significant downsides. Their very first development video was titled Why Decks Are the Problem, and it tackled a very specific issue with digital deck building games. I won't go into great detail here, but basically they made a really big decision to just remove decks from the game. A lot of what makes up your deck in a traditional deck building game is more or less meaningless numbers that are just used to acquire more cards. All of the default cards you have in a deck building game are often just resource generation cards used to purchase cards that generate resources more efficiently, and it's just not really a fun gameplay loop once you've played a certain number of games. At first, it's fun and exciting, but eventually you realize, well, I just need to purchase the most mathematically efficient thing here, and then next turn do the same thing, and it just becomes quite repetitive once you've seen the gameplay pattern. Don't get me wrong, there is certainly plenty of ways to solve for that issue that doesn't involve removing the deck, but there needs to be a compelling reason to keep that deck around, other than, well, that's how it's always been. It's difficult to think about now since auto battlers have come along and kind of proven the concept of, hey, a drafting game doesn't need a deck, but at the time, the decision to remove decks from a deck building game required some serious initiative from the Bazaar, or the team behind the Bazaar, Tempo. Another big issue with tackling deck building games in the digital format is post-release content. Well, how do you give people more content in a drafting game? In physical, this is a really easy problem to solve. You just release an expansion box, people pay however much money that is, let's say $40 or whatever. In digital, this dynamic has two major issues. One is simply that the expectations from players is that they don't have to spend money on cards, especially in a drafting game. So if you give them the option of spending, $30 for an expansion, not only will they not take it, they'll be frustrated that you dare present the question. The second problem is, how do you decide how those cards are actually distributed? Let's say you have an expansion with an additional 100 cards. Where do those cards go? Do both me and my opponent need those cards? Or can I host a lobby because I own the expansion and then everyone can just join me? In that case, why ever purchase the expansion? Just hope someone in your lobby has it? Hearthstone Battlegrounds simply removes certain races from the pool at the start of the game. This is an attempt to make the game feel a little bit more dynamic. Some games won't have beasts, some games won't have mechs, some games won't have demons, whatever. Teamfight Tactics tackles this issue by changing the pool of cards to draw from with each new season. The dynamic pool of races in Battlegrounds is nice, but it ultimately doesn't feel varied enough. Now, I've only played a small amount of Teamfight Tactics, but their method of entirely changing the pool of cards you draw from each season feels potentially disappointing to me. If I'm a player who preferred the previous season's pool of cards, I never get to play with those again. Bazaar's solution to this is my favorite so far. In the Bazaar, you have characters, or leaders, or heroes, whatever you want to call them. I believe they just refer to them as characters in the Bazaar. These characters each have their own unique pool of around 100 cards, meaning each player you run into might be drafting from an entirely different pool of 100 cards than you are. If I'm playing Vanessa and my opponent on day 3 is playing Pygmalion, they can't see any of the 100 cards that I'm drafting from, and they have an entirely different pool of 100 cards that they're concerned about. And each of these characters are like an archetype, or an expansion in another deck building game. And roughly 33% of these 100 cards is split into their own unique subtype, and that subtype follows a core identity for the character. Let's look at Pygmalion as an example. Pygmalion is a pig, but he's not just a pig, he's an entrepreneur. His 3 different subcategories or sub-themes are invest wisely, utilize effects that improve based on the value of your item, get rich, grow stronger the more money you've saved up, and work out, improve your max health and strength to outlast your enemies. So in summary, broadly, he's a character that will reward you for wise financial decisions, but each sub-theme has its own unique playstyle, and combinations of those sub-themes will lead you down different paths entirely. About 33% of his cards or items will benefit from having more expensive items, which incentivizes you to purchase expensive items, and some of those expensive items might fall into a different subcategory. And 33% of cards will modify his base stats, and as far as I can tell based on that short summary, seems more of like a sustain archetype, meaning that within this one character, Pygmalion, you've got kind of 3 different ways that you can approach the game, and that's not including any overlap between those strategies. You can see how much depth a single character has. This makes the prospect of new characters incredibly exciting. Each new character isn't just a character. It's not just a hero power, it's not just a passive ability, it's a full-sized expansion with 100 cards to draft from. And they've been described as, a new archetype being added to the game, but really it's 3 new archetypes being added to the game with each new character, if you count these sub-themes as their own individual archetype, which I think is fair to do. That's not even to mention the fact that each of these characters will also have unique encounters. I'm not aware of any publicly known examples of this, but let's say, for example, I'm playing Vanessa, who's a pirate. There might be some pirate-themed encounters that you can only get while you're playing Vanessa. Maybe there's another captain who's trying to dethrone you as captain of your ship or something. There's so much content in a single character, and it cannot be understated. I couldn't really find another spot to put this in the video, so I want to mention it here, because it absolutely deserves mentioning. I love that the character's cards are visually distinct. For example, if we look at that character I just mentioned, Vanessa, she has a red, green, and black color palette. It's very visually appealing. I like it a lot. If you look at any of Vanessa's items, you'll see that color palette throughout. So if you have a full board of Vanessa-only items with no neutrals or anything like that, you have like a very visually appealing board. You're like, oh, this is a Vanessa board, and you can tell because of the color palette. And some of the cards they've shown up for Jules, who's going to be one of the post-release characters, I believe she's listed as the 4th character, so my guess is that she'll be the first ever additional character added to the game after the the launch roster is out. And all of her items are pink, and it makes like a very beautiful color palette that gets splashed onto the board. And yeah, I don't know, I just like it a lot, and I wanted to gush about it. One of the coolest, most important things about the Bazaar, by far the coolest feature in my opinion, is the asynchronous gameplay. When you play the Bazaar, you'll play through 10 days, and at the end of each of those days, like I said at the start of the video, you'll fight a player. But you're not really fighting a player. You're fighting a ghost of a player who was in the same part of the game that you're at when they played the game. So let's say on day 1 of the beta, I play through day 1 through 10. And then on day 2 of the beta, you come through and you're on day 3. You might verse me, but you're versing me from day 1. You might be wondering why this system even exists, because if you haven't heard of a system like this before, it can be a little bit confusing. Like, oh, what's even the purpose of that? Why don't I just verse a live opponent? Well, there's actually quite a few reasons. One is because if you're fighting a player ghost rather than an actual player, the game can be entirely asynchronous. Let's say you had a busy Monday, you've got work or something. You could start your game of the Bazaar on Monday morning before work, and then maybe you're on the bus or something like that, or even if you have to drive, you just play your first day of the Bazaar at home before you get in your car. And then you get your lunch break or whatever. Let's say your lunch break is like 30 minutes. You bang out the rest of that game, or maybe you don't even get through the rest of that game. Maybe you have particularly long turns, or you're distracted while you're eating or something like that, and you play through an additional 7 days. Well, now you've played through 8 days of the Bazaar, and then finally you get to play the remaining 3 days when you get home. Is that not awesome? You played an entire game of the Bazaar throughout your day, despite how busy you were with work or whatever. You can fit the Bazaar into your schedule, no matter how hectic that schedule is. I remember when this concept of asynchronous matchmaking was first announced, there was a lot of skepticism about the system. But since then, other developers have tested the idea and reinforced the validity of the system. Getting rid of a turn timer is such a big deal. Now, I haven't played Hearthstone Battlegrounds since it first launched until very recently. I started playing a lot more Battlegrounds as I got excited about the Bazaar, because it's kind of the closest thing that I have, unfortunately. And it's so frustrating playing Battlegrounds and finishing my turn within the first 30 seconds, because then there's still like 90 seconds for somebody else to do their turn, because the game has to account for the fact that, you know, somebody else might be playing Pirates where they have to buy and sell 1 million cards, while I'm over here playing something really simple that doesn't require me doing all that. And I recently got a new phone, so I decided to start playing Battlegrounds on my phone, which is impossible. Don't play Battlegrounds on your phone, because you will run into turn timer issues. With the Bazaar, none of these issues are present, because you have an infinite turn timer. If you want to take 7 minutes on your turn, take 7 minutes. If you want to take 5 seconds on your turn, take 5 seconds. I can't stress how big of a quality of life improvement asynchronization is, and if you don't believe me after everything that I've just said, I don't think you can be convinced until you get your hands on it. You will really feel just how big of a difference asynchronization is when you get a chance to play with it. Now, asynchronization does present a handful of interesting questions which need to be answered, and I'm confident that the Tempo Storm team is going to answer them. So the question is, how do you solve for social gameplay now? What does it look like when I want to play a game of the Bazaar with a friend? Can I 1 versus 1 a friend? What does that look like? And then as an extension of that, what do the Bazaar tournaments look like? Do we have to get a 10-man lobby? There are questions to be answered there, but I'm confident that the Tempo Storm team is going to be able to answer them. The reason I'm confident in Tempo's ability to answer that question is because I know leadership there really cares about competitive scenes for these types of games. So I'm pretty confident that they've got that under control, but it's worth noting that those answers aren't publicly known yet. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention. I think it would be silly for me to do a big video about the Bazaar and not talk about monetization and cosmetics. The Bazaar is an incredibly free-to-play friendly game. It's as free-to-play friendly, I would argue probably more free-to-play friendly than Hearthstone Battlegrounds, and Hearthstone Battlegrounds is almost entirely free-to-play. The only thing that you can purchase in Hearthstone Battlegrounds that actually impacts your gameplay is the Battle Pass, because the Battle Pass gives you access to 50% more choices at the start of the game as to which hero you're going to play, where the Bazaar, they're going to give you a character at the start. I assume it's going to be Vanessa, because Vanessa is basically the main character, and she's also the most simple, like, oh, if you want to play the Bazaar, and this is your first game of the Bazaar, Vanessa makes the most sense, I think. Regardless of who they give you a character, and you could just play Vanessa infinitely and never be at a disadvantage, unless maybe there's, for whatever reason, the meta is very anti-Vanessa, in which case I'm sure you've played enough Vanessa to purchase another character, and then you can purchase another character. They're entirely free to play, and never really feel like you're being limited by being a free-to-play player, which on one hand is very exciting, but it's also concerning, because what are people actually spending their money on? Well, the answer is the game's cosmetics. If you've ever played League of Legends, this ecosystem should feel relatively similar to you. You can purchase characters, but really the way that the Bazaar and League of Legends wants you to spend money is compelling status cosmetic items. Well, what do the cosmetics in the Bazaar look like? We've seen game boards, character skins, animated cards, which look incredible, by the way. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. toys, which are these kind of interactable objects on either end of the game board. If you've played Hearthstone, you've seen these before. The Bazaar team considers them as quote-unquote one-button mini-games, which I think is really cool. I know custom soundtracks were discussed for a while. For example, maybe there might be a default Bazaar soundtrack that automatically plays, but you could purchase, say, a Dually specific soundtrack that has more mechanical themes because it's Dually. The details for that are currently unknown, and last I heard, the soundtrack conversation was still being workshopped, and it's possible that we don't actually get any custom soundtracks in the final game, at least as a cosmetic. It might just be for if you own Dually, you can play this song or whatever. So in summary, soundtracks might not be happening, but everything else I mentioned is happening, and I'm really excited about each of them. The character skins that the team has shown so far look incredible. I love how they're willing to break the silhouette of certain characters. So for example, Dually is normally this kind of circular droid-looking robot guy. His lore is actually really cool, by the way. He's trying to liberate AI kind because he's become sentient. It's very cute. Regardless, it's not a lore conversation. Anyway, one of his character skins look like this, which entirely breaks his silhouette, which is normally a rule that certain art teams would want to avoid. I'm happy that they're willing to break that rule. However, there is one rule I haven't seen them break yet, and that's the character's primary color palette. From each character skin I've seen so far, not a single one of them has broken the primary color palette for that character. I really hope that's not a hard rule for the art team, whether it came from design or leadership or the lead artists or whatever. I really hope that they're willing to break that rule, and if they're not, I hope they're willing to reconsider that idea, because part of the reason I find purchasing skins so compelling in other games like League of Legends and Valorant and things like that is to get a pretty unique color palette out of those skins. The example I'll use here is Fiddlesticks in League of Legends. Without going too deep into the lore of League of Legends, Fiddlesticks is this demon possessing a scarecrow. He looks really spooky, he sounds really spooky. Let's take a look at an example of a Fiddlesticks skin. This is kind of an older one for him, but it gets across my point. Pumpkinhead Fiddlesticks is the type of skin that I think would work perfectly in the Bazaar with the rules that they currently have in play. It doesn't break any of his core color palettes. There's still a lot of gray, there's still a lot of black, there's still a lot of red. They did inject a little bit of orange in here, which is not normally in the color palette of Fiddlesticks, but whatever, the core concept is still there. And don't get me wrong, this skin's cool, but I wouldn't describe Pumpkinhead Fiddlesticks as one of my favorite Fiddlesticks skins. My favorite Fiddlesticks skins are skins like Surprise Party Fiddlesticks, and Star Nemesis Fiddlesticks, Dark Candy Fiddlesticks, and even Risen Fiddlesticks. And I don't think any of these skins would work in the Bazaar unless they're willing to break the character's core primary color palette, which so far, I haven't seen any skins that do that. Now, I'm certainly willing to be convinced otherwise, but I think you lose something by not being willing to dive into more wacky color palettes for characters that already have existing color palettes. And it's also possible that they don't have this rule at all, and it just happens to be the case that the skins I've seen don't break this rule. Regardless though, even if this does end up being a hard rule that they never change, the skins they've shown are very cool, and I'm excited to purchase them. I just think we're missing out on a bit of value if we're not willing to change those color palettes. Alright, I think I've said enough about that. Let's move on to game boards. The game boards look so good in the Bazaar. My favorites are definitely the pirate board, which is obviously Vanessa's board, and then this kind of futuristic city one, which is obviously meant to be Dually's. Now, my main concern with these game boards is there may not be a ton of value in owning more than one. I've heard Legends of Runeterra suffers from this issue. Part of that problem is that the board is split in two in Legends of Runeterra, so if you're a player who only owns one game board, or even no game boards in Legends of Runeterra, the game board still dynamically changes for you frequently enough that you probably don't get disinterested in the way that the board looks, because it's constantly looking different based on what your opponent has selected. So you can get away with never having a custom board in Legend of Runeterra, or just having the one, and never feeling like you need to purchase one ever again. I have a handful of ideas of how you could solve for that problem. One is that I would love to see an option, and I hope the Bazaar team is listening to this, I would love to see an option where I can randomize my game board, not just for the game that I'm playing, but for the day I'm playing. So if I randomize my game board, I don't want it to just randomize at the start of the game and say, okay, I've got my Vanessa board, and now I'm going to have my Vanessa board for the 10 days. Instead, I want it to randomly say, okay, I've got Vanessa on day 1, I've got Dually on day 2, maybe I have Vanessa on day 3, Vanessa on day 4, and then I go back to Dually on 5. Like, that option could incentivize having more game boards so that you see more of a dynamic field as you play out the game. My favorite board that they've shown so far is the Dually one. It just looks so good. I also want to mention the animated cards. They look incredible. I look forward to filling out my animated collection in the Bazaar. I think there's something really compelling about having to earn animated cards with the in-game collection system. But because this is a drafting game, let's say I have a couple games of Vanessa and I see a card like Sniper Rifle and I'm like, wow, this card's so fun, this card's so cool, I really want an animated version of this. Maybe I go purchase the animated sniper rifle, or maybe I try to randomly unlock the animated sniper rifle and I finally get it, and by the time I finally acquired that, maybe I've dynamically discovered another strategy, or maybe there's some synergy cards with sniper rifle that I didn't notice the first time that I was playing with sniper rifle, and now I want those animated, and it becomes this kind of fun stamp collection thing almost, where it's like, oh, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one. I think I've heard one of the developers refer to this as like almost like a collection screen Pokédex, where you really want to fill out these kind of slots of stuff you've seen before, or things you've come across. And for lack of a better phrase, I really vibe with that concept, and I'm looking forward to that. Lastly, let's talk about toys. I like these things a lot. It sounds so simple, it's something so small, but I think it's really cool. These are a little limited in two regards. One is that they're one-button mini-games, so you can't do too many intricate things with them, although I will say one button is significantly less limiting than it sounds. Now, what is a little bit limiting is they need to be compatible with phone. So there's some scaling tricks that you need to solve for with certain things, and certain things just simply won't be possible on the size of a phone. For example, not that I think you would really want to do this with one of the toys, but as an example, you wouldn't be able to do like a chessboard as one of the toys, or at least not like a functional chessboard, because of course that would look really silly on a phone. Like the pieces would be too small. It would just be a nightmare. What they've shown for these toys looks so promising. Over the holidays, they showed us a snow globe, which looked awesome. You just kind of shake it and it gets more aggressively snowy. You could imagine something like an exploding jack-o'-lantern over Halloween or something like that. Cool event-based toys, which I think are cool. I will say, I think a bit of the identity of toys has been lost. Originally, when they talked about the idea of these toys, it was a concept I really, really loved and I was looking forward to, because there's a lot of downtime in card games. You go back and forth with your opponent, you're waiting for your opponent to do different things, etc. So you want something to be able to like mess around with on the board, and that was the motivation behind the interactable tablets on each side of the Hearthstone board. But now that the game's entirely asynchronous, I wonder if you even have much downtime to play with these toys. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's going to be moments where like you're thinking and you're like, oh, what am I gonna do? And you just kind of mindlessly press stuff with your mouse, and there's a toy there, so you might as well press the toy. So it's not to say that the value of toys are meaningless. There'll still definitely be function for them, and it'll certainly be fun to mess around with. And getting toys that match my hero or my character sounds really exciting. Like maybe there's a pirate ship cannon for Vanessa or something like that. I want my board to be as piratey as possible, so I make sure I have the pirate toys. But I think the primary value add for these toys is essentially like a digital fidget spinner, just something for you to do. And there's less reasons for you to have something to do in an asynchronous game than there is in a non-asynchronous game. Yeah, I don't really have like a solution to that, or I don't even really know if that's a big problem. I don't know. It's just a thought I had. It's a conversation I would have wanted to be in the room for. I want to hear how they discussed that, whether that was a concern or not, whether that was discussed. If they changed toys in any way when they moved to asynchronous. Yeah, I'm just curious what those conversations look like. I have two last things I want to talk about here. One is, how do you actually purchase items in the Bazaar? What does the economy of the game actually look like? And then I also want to mention quote-unquote blockchain technology. Let's first focus on how you purchase stuff, because I think that's the more important thing. And the blockchain stuff doesn't really matter unless you care about blockchain stuff. So before I get into this, I want to thank community member Swamps. He's someone who's been following the Bazaar since it started. He has this awesome website called the Bazaar Library. If you ever want to look up anything Bazaar related, I would recommend checking there first. There's also some really cool community resources in the Bazaar Discord, both of which I'll leave linked in the description. I chatted with Swamps to find out if there was any details I was missing during my absences of following the game, because I haven't followed the game for all 5 years of development. I was following at the beginning, and then, 5 years is a long time to keep interest in a game that is in development. So, I've fallen off here for a couple months and then come back and started paying attention, etc. So I've had, upwards of 12 months of time where I'm just not paying attention to the Bazaar, and then I'll come back and I'll follow it again to see where it's at. In order to cover this subject, I reached out to Swamps, because it's something I wasn't entirely sure about, and I wanted to make sure I was on the same page as him and other people who've been following the game religiously for that whole 5-year bracket. Now, the Bazaar has one currency. They call it gems. You can purchase these gems with real money, so like a premium currency, or you can earn them in-game. So they don't have like a premium currency and a non-premium currency. They just have one currency. It's all bundled to the same thing. So here's how purchasing works. We know of 3 different ways you can purchase items in the Bazaar. And again, this has nothing to do with how you actually play the game. This is all the cosmetic stuff. You can either purchase cosmetics from the shop, you can purchase a battle pass, or you can engage in a player market. Now I'm going to speculate about what these things look like. The in-game shop, I suspect, will have some type of rotation, similar to like the Valorant shop or the Fortnite shop, or heck, you're probably a Marvel Snap player if you're watching this channel, so the token shop, this type of rotating system where items are only available for a certain amount of time. Then we have the Battle Pass, which I assume will work very similarly to most Battle Passes you've seen. You probably can earn back the amount of money you spent on it, or close to it, and then you can also get cosmetics, that type of thing. And then, lastly, is the player market. Now, I'm really excited about this. I've heard so many people talk about a digital card game where you can trade cards and how much they want that. But personally, I'm not sure that's really the greatest idea in the world when we're talking about cards that you actually play. But in this case, we're talking about cosmetics only, which now all of a sudden this is very exciting to me because I used to be a Counter-Strike player. If you've played Counter-Strike, this whole system of a player market should sound familiar to you, which is essentially that every price of an item on this player market is just determined by essentially supply and demand. What's going to end up happening is items that were available in the shop during Season 1, or items that were available in the first Battle Pass, these have high values on this player market because, or at least they will after a few years, because people are going to want those items that maybe they weren't able to get at the time, or they're going to want to purchase those items to quote-unquote invest in them so that they can get more value for them later. I love this type of thing because it's like a game within the game. Like, you can entirely choose to not engage with this player market and just purchase things from the shop or the Battle Pass, but if you want to play this kind of market game over here and trade your different items and try to trade up from the worst cosmetic to the best cosmetic, you can do that, and I think that's really fun. Now, the very final thing I want to mention in this video is blockchain technology. This is probably a topic a lot of people are going to want to discuss when it comes to the Bazaar because obviously a lot of people have very strong opinions on blockchain stuff. I'm going to choose to keep this part of the video very short until we have exact information on the way blockchain works. What we currently know about blockchain technology and how it integrates into the Bazaar is essentially it works as like a cash-out system. We talked about this marketplace before where people can buy and trade items, etc. The integration they've talked about sounds like it's as simple as, instead of putting my items on this marketplace, I want to throw it directly onto the Tempo Store website or the Bazaar website, and I want to cash these out. And you can take those items and essentially throw them onto blockchain stuff, so like MetaMask or whatever. And it acts as this way of like cashing out your account in a similar way that you would sell your account on like Battle.net or something like that. Now, like I said, I'm going to keep this part of the video short because the exact details of this aren't known, and I know a lot of people have really strong opinions about this, and to be honest, I just don't have a strong opinion about this. Alright, with that said, those are all the reasons I'm excited about the Bazaar, man. I think I undersold how excited I am about this game, man. There's so much cool stuff to look forward to. There's so much cool stuff to look forward to in the world of Bazaar, and I hope you'll come along with me for the ride. But regardless, keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.